But I wanted to start by mentioning three men who've meant a lot in my life. Two of them were close friends of Wallace Stegner. Those men are David Freed and William Bill Mulder. I do believe that Bill Mulder was the inspiration for the character Joe Mulder in Big Rock Candy Mountain and Recapitulation. They were great men, both play a role in this paper. The third is the only writing teacher I ever had, and I don't want him held accountable for that. But Paige could tell you some entertaining stories about me. When I applied for the fellowship, I asked for a recommendation, and I wrote and I said, I'm not sure you recall my writing, but I'm pretty sure you remember me for other reasons. But he has had a huge influence on my perspective, and I want to thank him for teaching me as an arrogant young 20-year-old, warning me not to do this. I did it anyway, but again, that's not his fault. Now, over the last year, I've come to appreciate one of the reasons I admire and love Wallace Stegner so much is I share many of his bad habits as a historian. I like to write sweeping histories. I like to tell stories. I love colorful characters. I like to rope the past together with the present. And I also admit that often I will create cartoon characters, although I think I'd have to confess that while his Brigham Young, practical Brigham Young, looks a lot like Dudley Do-Right, mine looks a lot more like Snidely Whiplash. And I think you can compare our handcart studies with telling effect. Now, I asked my friend and mentor, Floyd O'Neill, what is there new to say about Wallace Stegner? And he said very bluntly, not much. As Bill Mulder said, Stegner said it best already. So I have fallen back on my personal perspective as a Mormon insider-outsider to consider Stegner's portrait and relationship with my native state and my people. As Dale Morgan advised, Mormons, quote, might profit by meditating upon Mr. Stegner's thoughtful comments on their faith, their society, and their history. Stegner learned much from the Mormons when what they gave him mattered a great deal. This afternoon, I'll ask what Stegner's long study of their history and culture might give back to modern Mormons, and ponder historian Gary Topping's question, why have the Latter-day Saints been so willing to sit still for verbal drubbings from a Gentile that they would never accept from one of their own? George Stegner arrived in Salt Lake City one bright spring afternoon in 1921, driving a brand new Essex Super 6, crammed from running boards to roofline with his family, their possessions, and smuggled Canadian hooch. His son's recreation of the instant his family rolled around the base of Ensign Peak and looked upon the city of the saints evokes a "this is the place" moment. "Gee," said Bruce Mason, Stegner's alter ego, "this is a big place." "Isn't it nice?" said his mother. "It's like all the towns through here, so green and nice." "Holy cat," said George, "I could sell whiskey in this town as fast as I could haul it in." When he landed in Zion at age 12, Wallace Stegner's hard-scrambled childhood had made him a modern Ishmael. He found himself among the Mormons, who did not appreciate the speakeasies that generated his father's income and kept his family constantly on the move. Instead of feeling he was an outcast, the boy and his older brother, Cecil, encountered a lot of plain warmth and goodwill, too. I have never ceased to be grateful for what they gave us when what they gave us mattered a great deal. I was never tempted to adopt their beliefs, but I could never write about them except as a friend. Utah's obsession with its history eventually made Stegner aware of growing up entirely without history and set me on the trail to find or construct some for myself. The Mormons introduced the young tumbleweed to a community with strong families and clearly defined principles, a tradition of sacrifice for the common good, and a desert-tested, common-sense practicality forged over 7 decades in the arid West. This culture came with a complicated persecution complex and a beleaguered sense of its fundamental righteousness as it confronted the Roaring Twenties. Salt Lake is a divided concept, a complex idea, Stegner later said. To the devout, it is more than a place. It is a way of life, a corner of the material and realizable heaven. Its soul is held together by the roots of the family and the cornerstone of the temple. Relations between Mormons and Gentiles, and the many Jack Mormons caught in the middle, lacked the passions that had burned so fiercely during the polygamy wars. As a teenager, Stegner found a comfortable middle ground in Utah's bifurcated society. Ultimately, the Latter-day Saints influenced him deeply. If I seem to relate individual identity to a social group, I don't think that's so strange in Utah, and I think Utah taught it to me. I was shaped by the places and people among whom I grew up, and they taught me ways of seeing and feeling. The natural wonders he encountered as a youth and the excellent education he received in the, quote, homey provincial city of Salt Lake shaped the man and artist. The staggering beauty of Utah's mountains and the Colorado Canyon country captured Stegner's heart and encouraged his lifelong love of the natural West. Looking back, he realized how much brute accident had set his life's course. I didn't choose a literary career and dedicate myself to it. I didn't choose the West as a place I would write about and from. They chose me. As Lynn Stegner has said, hunting, fishing, and sparking in Utah's backcountry left the West and its landscapes imprinted on his eyeballs. The Great Basin's geography you can see made it the place where he felt most himself. As a native, I know of no one who has captured so well how beautiful this town really is, how it lies under a bright clarity of light, protected behind its rampart mountains, or described so miraculously the moody light and startling contrasts of a lake that belongs on the moon. His adopted hometown helped Wallace Stegner build a usable past for himself. Stegner expressed his warm admiration for the everyday virtues of the Mormons, the old-fashioned virtues, the virtues that have to do with hospitality, with family life, with the sort of welcome that strays have in a big family. Salt Lake's warm and open families had a lot of what I'd always missed. Though our family was tight, it was not that kind of warm and open family. His Utah neighbors threw open the doors in every direction. It wasn't a desperation move, but part of living their religion. The family is so important in Mormon religion that without it, the religion would hardly exist. All his writing, Stegner told Richard Echelon, came from what he knew. My involvement in history is personal and scholarly. I wouldn't have got into Mormon history if I'd never lived in Salt Lake and lived in the Ward House on Tuesday nights. He wrote about John Wesley Powell because he loved southern Utah's canyon country. His nonfiction was an offshoot of personal experiences and personal acquaintances. Stegner's wistful love affair with Salt Lake reflected his longing for home and his lack of roots. That lack of roots seemed to me a deprivation, both personally and professionally. His first absence from Zion persuaded him, I am not as homeless as I thought. nor was he a half-stranger in the city where I have lived the longest, a Gentile in the New Jerusalem. He loved this place and adopted Salt Lake as his home because he never had one to speak of as a kid, said Dave Freed, Stegner's high school pal and tennis teammate. No friends, he later wrote, ever so closely and effortlessly touched my heart, as did Freed, Jack Irvine, and Red Cowan. Here, for the first time, I can remember triumphs, or what seemed like triumph. In Salt Lake, I fell in love for the first time, and was rudely jilted for the first time, and recovered for the first time, remembering his romances with two Mormon girls, Juanita Crawford and Helen Foster, who later became one of the first journalists to interview Mao Zedong, and the woman who added gung-ho to the American vocabulary. Stegner became a writer in Salt Lake because I had this little gift, which, like a beaver's teeth, kept growing and making me chew to wear them down, or else they'd lock my mouth shut. He was university literary as a kind of game while an undergraduate at the University of Utah, but it never occurred to me that I could become a writer. He insisted only a graduate fellowship led him to forsake rising in the linoleum trade. He worked part-time at a rug store owned by the Irvines and sold linoleum and rugs. Stegner discovered his vocation in 1935 when he returned to teach in Utah and felt a vague form of unrest. I didn't know it, but it was my teeth growing. He sat down and in 3 hours wrote Bugle Song, a brilliant short story born of sheer talent. After that, it turned out that I had to chew because I had those teeth. And it turned out that I had to chew cottonwoods because those were the trees I grew up among, the ones that I found handy for chewing. In the Big Rock Candy Mountain, the autobiographical novel Stegner called not a literary effort, but an act of exorcism. His father's big car, irregular hours, and loaded suitcases got the neighbors talking. Like the Stegners, the Masons couldn't stay too long in one place, so they moved and moved again. But the book's description of Utah society is sympathetic and affectionate. In recapitulation, Salt Lake received even kinder treatment. Are you properly grateful to be living in paradise? Bruce Mason asked an old friend. The Book of Mormon makes heaven into a sort of New Jerusalem with gold-paved streets and windows of opal and ruby. But the real Mormon heaven was made by hand, and it's this. It's an oasis in the desert. The young Stegner brothers found a warm welcome in Mormon homes, but Stegner recognized how different his mother's experience was in Salt Lake. Her erratic husband prevented Hilda Stegner from ever enjoying the space or stability she needed to achieve the one dream she had all her life, building a home for her beloved sons. And Utah's insular culture left her isolated. She was hungry, you know, he told Richard Echelon. She was hungry for women's company. She was hungry for all kinds of intellectual excitement, and she had very little way of getting it except by reading. As a social outcast, she had few friends in Salt Lake. Adults couldn't make it into Mormon society the way a child could, the way that I could. I went off to Mutual, played basketball, went to ward amusement halls, but there was no such entree for her. Ella Mason's encounter with two women from the university at Brighton made her realize her psychosocial isolation. In one of the Big Rock Candy Mountain's most moving scenes, Elsa lures chipmunks with peanuts and crumbs. The first time she got one to come into her lap for a nut, she laughed out loud for the pure joy of having made friends with someone. It seems to me, thinking it over, that she had a terribly limited and lonesome life, Stegner recalled. His oft-expressed affection for the Mormons and his adopted hometown obscure much of the pain that haunted his coming of age. My childhood was buried in Saskatchewan, my youth and my dead in Salt Lake. And I was never going back to those places to live. A confession that captures the man's enigmatic mix of love and bitterness. So what made young Wally Stegner feel so at home in the fields of the Lord? And what made Wallace Stegner recollect the city of the saints with such affection? The boy arrived at an opportune time as Mormon culture transformed itself from a radical new religious movement trying to revolutionize the whole world into a mainstream American faith obsessed with forgetting the wilder side of its combative youth. As frontier Utah disappeared in a storm of industrialization and cultural innovation, the religion's prophets faced a problem: modernity. Between 1900 and 1930, Mormonism struggled to redefine itself, and the 1920s compelled its aging patriarchs to respond to changes they found baffling. The religion had to deal with, quote, conflicting pressures to build the community, provide wholesome entertainment, and mollify potential competitors and critics, as Tom Alexander pointed out. The best symbol of Utah's age of accommodation is Saltaire, the extraordinary pleasure dome the LDS Church built in 1893 to compete with a string of successful and sinful resorts. Unfortunately, you've seen Bob Steensman's wonderful pictures of that particular pleasure palace. The church hoped Saltaire would provide a wholesome place of recreation for Mormon families, and by building a thoroughly modern Coney Island of the West, it sought to diffuse Utah's image as a strange place of alien people and customs, as an apostle said. Part and parcel of Mormonism's adjustment to modernism, Saltaire was to be both a typical American amusement park and a place that provided a safe environment for its Mormon patrons, goals that were somewhat incompatible. Saltaire became emblematic of the LDS Church's long campaign, quote, to join the world while at the same time trying to minimize its influence and avoid its excesses. At the peak of Saltaire's glory in 1924, 15-year-old Wally Stegner landed a glorious summer job selling hot dogs at Mormondom's Xanadu by the Salt Flats. When the spectacular Pleasure Palace opened, a headline trumpeted the claim that its extravagant Moorish pavilion, built at the end of a 4,000-foot causeway, was an immense affair not rivaled by the most famous resorts in the East. Its 2,500 pilings proved virtually indestructible. Some still stand today. None but Western people would ever have built this, the Salt Lake Tribune proclaimed. Something magical about the place evoked Kublai Khan's palace, the nostalgic vendor of hot dogs for the hundreds recalled. This pleasure dome was never built. It was decreed and rose like an exaltation. Early on, Sunday beer sales were an issue. Man that is born of woman for 6 days is full of trouble, opined the Deseret News. On the 7th, he goes to Saltaire and becometh full of liquid refreshments. Tension between the religion and its resort never relented. There were fairly constant clashes between the recreational principle and Mormon scruples. Compared with the ordinary Midway, Saltaire was almost squeaky clean, Stegner wrote, but everyone knew where to buy a bottle, and there were girls who were around so frequently that we thought them employees. His brother had a lot of stories to tell, most of which I could not believe, but I would have liked to. Saltaire's planners dreamed of a wholesome place, but in the most erotic scene of Big Rock Candy Mountain, Chet Mason swam with his naked girlfriend, quote, down in the caverns measureless to man, among the pilings. I remember it like a lost Eden, Stegner recalled. Then disaster struck. In April 1925, as Wally dreamed of another summer selling Coney Island Red Hots in the balmy lake breeze, he watched from East High School as smoke and flames erupted on the edge of the lake. Smoke on the water, fire on the flood. It made a spectacular blaze visible from every point in the valley. The glory days of salt air were over. Wallace Stegner never hid his lack of religion. About God, I simply do not know. I don't think we can know, he wrote in 1950. Passionate faith made him suspicious because it hangs witches and burns heretics. And generally, I am more in sympathy with the witches and heretics than with the sectarians who hang and burn them. He feared immoderate zeal, be it Christian, Muslim, or communist, for it created an orthodoxy with a sword in its hand. Latter-day Saints should thank Stegner for telling their story with such clarity and verve, enabling them to see the familiar, both in their history and the daily life around them, in fresh terms, his friend Bill Mulder observed. But Mulder warned that some of them would find his personal credo troubling for its secular humanism. Dread words. Stegner wrote as a non-Mormon but not a Mormon hater. He did not believe in their faith, but he did not quarrel with it either. That faith fascinated him. Here, after all, quote, was a faith that people died for. But he dealt with it only when it affected people's actions. He was after visceral history and what faith did to the people who held it. He respected the religion's organization, both historical and modern, but he was suspicious of its hierarchy, then and now, in the way I am suspicious of any very large, very powerful commercial and industrial corporation. Stegner refused, quote, to whitewash the Mormon tribal crimes, which were as grievous as their wrongs, but sought to write the history of the saints in terms of the people who made it. He adopted George Bancroft's rule for historians. I try to present them in their terms and judge them in mine. That I do not accept the faith that possessed them does not mean I doubt their frequent devotion and heroism to its service, especially their women. Their women were incredible. While Stegner's view of the Mormons is often admiring, he also sees them as individuals with particular graces and flaws, Zizi Papanikolaou observed. If Zizi's here, I've got a book for you to sign. Stegner viewed Mormons as a people sometimes at odds with democratic values and the darker side of their history. This dualistic perspective reflected Stegner's affection for the people who had reflected his affection for the people and his discomfort with the religion's authoritarian inclinations, which he muted in the Gathering of Zion, where he deliberately let immigrants speak for themselves so that there was literally no attitude I could take, pro or con. I was simply trying to recreate the experience as the people who had lived it. That seemed to me to be the only fair way. Everything a historian writes is interpretation, but Stegner's sense of fairness extended to a consideration of his audience's sensibilities. In Mormon country, I had inadvertently made a few comments that some people thought condescending. I didn't want that to happen again. At the same time, I hope nobody comes out of my books thinking I'm anti-Mormon. I'm mixed about them. Stegner's 3 decades of correspondence with the polymathic Dale L. Morgan, who Stegner praised as, quote, a cross between a steam shovel and Jesus Christ, provides insights into his approach to the Mormon past. Shortly before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Stegner outlined the astonishing parallels between old Deseret and modern totalitarian states. The whole thing is there. Private army, secret police, encirclement myth, territorial dynamism, self-sufficiency, chosen people, absolute dictatorship operating through party rule, group psychology, esoteric symbols, and sacred or distinguishing uniforms. Morgan found Stegner's remarks on the singularly complete parallels in Mormon autocracy and modern totalitarianism amusing. He pointed to even more parallels, including experiments with wage and price controls. But Morgan was protective of the faith of his fathers. He warned any study of the Mormons as an American dictatorship had to give due weight to frontier conditions. Using totalitarianism as a yardstick to measure Mormonism was dangerous, he advised. The religion went through complex social mutations in its first half century. He pointed to the psychology of dispossession and the frontal attack by a society upon an environment. The whole Mormon experience with the land must be taken into consideration in any dissection of Mormon society. What aggravated Stegner most during his work on Mormon history was the polemical nature of the record and the suppression of evidence, which left no firm ground for historians to take account of all the facts and allow for all the delusion, hatred, passions, paranoia, lying, bad faith, concealment, and distortion of evidence that were contributed by both the Mormons and their enemies. You can't have partial truth. You've got to have it all, and no historian can operate with some of the cards missing from the deck, he said. The only way to get away from attack and defense history is to throw the archives open to everybody. Stegner felt that what the Latter-day Saints took from their history was ambiguous. They had learned that paranoid lesson of persecution. Mormons always expect to be persecuted. It's something they can learn. They learn from their heritage, but they could also learn that for the last 80 years, that persecution doesn't exist anymore, not in the ways they envision it. Gentile tales of destroying angels might be lurid and exaggerated, but it's not based upon myth. It's based upon a fact, Stegner pointed out. There was such a guy as Port Rockwell. Generations of faithful Mormon historians have avoided two obvious questions. Why did their religion prove so controversial? And why did Mormonism, like all radical new religious movements, both provoke and perpetrate acts of savagery? Typically, Stegner addressed the problems with disarming directness. While their troubles had different causes, one way and another, the Mormons managed to get on bad terms with everybody, given time. A chosen people is probably inspiring for the chosen to live among. It is not so comfortable for outsiders to live with. He acknowledged their admirable traits of endurance, discipline, faith, and sisterly charity, the qualities so thoroughly celebrated by Mormon writers. But he pointed out that their humanity allocated them a normal amount of human cussedness, vengefulness, masochism, backbiting, violence, ignorance, selfishness, and gullibility. Bill Mulder hoped that Wallace Stegner would be read and remembered among the Mormons for as long as grass grows. Why did Mormons like Wallace Stegner and let him get away with being so honest about their past? Much like James Bordeaux of Fort Laramie, he, quote, made them feel what they were in fact, disciplined and well-behaved, and demonstrated what has become a truism since, that no one is so popular among the saints as a Gentile who expresses a good opinion of them. Stegner wrote popular history, history that spoke to people because it was their story. And for his histories of the Latter-day Saints especially pleased his Mormon friends. Gordon B. Hinckley's The Faith Prophet at the turn of the 21st century told Hal Schindler The Gathering of Zion was his favorite book. I have a great admiration for Wallace Stegner, Hinckley said of his University of Utah classmate. His little book on the Mormons is a very moving book. He's done a good job and I have enjoyed it. Western historians hold Stegner's treatment of the religion in equally high regard. But in today's Mormon culture, especially the enormous blogosphere created after church officials called for a web-based defense of the faith, sees LDS history as a war zone. The shift in perspective is stunning. If you want to read a book which was written by someone who hates the Latter-day Saints, then this is the book for you. An angry young viewer wrote, reviewing Gathering of Zion on Amazon.com, "This author has crossed the bridge between being factual and being a zealot, bigot. I was raised not to bash anyone's religion, but I guess that was not the case with this bitter old man," who wrote it when he was 4 years younger than I am now. Many of the faith scholars still view its past as combat with the forces of darkness, a division that helped shape Mormon historical identity. Observe Brent Rogers, a graduate student at the University of Nebraska. Faithful historians remain firmly entrenched in denouncing scholarship they find threatening. Clearly, there is still a tremendous divide, Rogers wrote. It is natural for debate over a contentious topic to occur, but because of the intellectual homogenization of the church, it seems that scholars and others, both Mormon and non-Mormon, continue to view Mormon history as a divisive anti- and pro-paradigm. Wallace Stegner's legacy inspires hope that we can do better. Now, I've got a tribute to Mormon country, which would take 2 minutes to, can we squeeze it in? Better? Okay. In 1998, Patty Limerick asked if Stegner's Mormon country deserved to be republished. 20 years had passed since I'd read the book, but a second look gave me a new appreciation of its value. What began as a popular exploration of an intriguing American region was now an invaluable record of a lost world. Stegner foresaw that rural Utah's isolation could not last. Inevitably, America would discover the spectacular scenery of Mormon country. When it did, even the little settlements off the railroads and the main highways will be in the world, and the assimilation of Mormon country into the United States would be complete. But the spectacular and remote region is still, quote, a sanctuary to outlaw and zealot, an artist and white Indian and Nephite. For all its homey domesticity and its tradition of laborious piety, it is a country that breeds the impossibles. Before his death, Wallace Stegner witnessed any number of impossibles transform Mormon country in the American West. It seems to me that the oasis will get bigger, noisier, dirtier, and more crowded, he prophesied, and the spaces will get all torn up by mining, overgrazing, by reckless recreationers, by off-road vehicles, unless the BLM gets smart and stops them. His dark vision came true. The bucolic villages and contrary singularities I knew and loved as a child have disappeared in a burst of prosperity and excess that would have flabbergasted the founders of American Fork and St. George. Just as Glen Canyon disappeared beneath the waters of Lake Powell, the Mormon country of 1942 has vanished in frantically booming Mormon Utah as inexorably as the Lombardy poplars that once lined its quiet, colorful main streets. Thank you very much.